Destroyed routinely, and we're in a state of perpetual war. That's the bad part. The good part is that we have answers for that. We literally do have answers, and it can be found in the principles of liberty and in our Constitution. Next week, matter of fact, it'll be this week, I believe it's on Thursday, we will be having a special event on the House floor that Dennis Kucinich and I and others have worked on. It's a long overdue debate. It's a debate on the Afghan war. It should have happened many years ago. But it looks like we'll have 3 hours of debate and then a vote to find out whether they have the legal right to pursue this war. Obviously, they do not have a legal right to pursue a war that has been not declared. I'm not predicting we'll win that vote, but I can predict that a lot more people will start thinking correctly about the war and the perpetual war. One of the provisions that came out of the last administration was this whole idea of preventive war. This is astounding to me. Preventive war means that we initiate the wars. We must once again adhere to the Constitution, never engage in war unless it's declared, and fight them to win them and get them over with by the why we shouldn't be over there or in the various countries is that we can't afford them, and it undermines our liberties. War is the health of the state. And more times you're in war, as long as you're in war, people are more susceptible to giving up their liberties. And now we're in a state of perpetual war. This has to change. Now the practical answer would be change our minds, change our attitude. I was asked one time in a debate a few years ago, maybe somebody watched it, they said, well, what would you do about these wars? And I said, we just marched in, why don't we just march home? But we will leave, but unfortunately we're going to leave under bad circumstances because this country will be declared bankrupt, and that is liable to come in a short order. When that happens, empires collapse. It's happened numerous times over history. We did not have to fight the Soviet Union. They had, the thousands of nuclear missiles and weapons, and we did not have to confront them. And they disintegrated because they had a flawed economic policy. Well, this country has been operating under a flawed economic policy now for a good 70 years, and the end is coming, and that is what we're witnessing at the present time. I mean, this is too difficult to come up with a better system.
Back home!
What we need to do is to understand the basic premises of individual liberty. Liberty is the reason for all political action, to restore and preserve liberty. The Constitution is a guideline and one that is supposed to hold the government in check. It's not supposed to hold the people in check. Wars will eventually bankrupt us along with the runaway welfare spending here in this country. Now, the one reason why I have talked about one little incident that we deal with, one little unit, and that's called the Federal Reserve, because it facilitates big government, because it facilitates war and it facilitates the welfare state, and therefore we cannot really survive this with a central bank, and that, of course, is the reason we must end up there. Fed will be ended like so much else will end in this country. It will end by default because the laws of economics tell us that you can't perpetually defraud the currency, print the paper, it eventually self-destructs, and something else will have to be done. And that will be an opportunity for us because then is the time for us to know what we believe in and to rebuild this country on these sound principles that we were so fortunate to have at the beginning. Those principles gave us the greatest amount of freedom and the greatest amount of prosperity in the history of mankind. But for quite a few years, and it's probably close to 100 years, there's been a steady erosion of those liberties and a steady erosion of our wealth. So when this comes, the bankruptcy will have to be declared. The reason we're in such a mess in Washington, nothing happens, and in a way that's good, because they're starting to recognize that they can't spend perpetually. They don't know that yet. They're still arguing how to spend money. They haven't yet heard our message that the end is here, that we have to quit. A lot of people just wonder how this will come about and how it will end. I think it will end not so much that we will end up with the right number of people in Congress and will pass better legislation. It will end with a failure of the state, the failure of the government. And we do talk a lot about secession and interposition and nullification, and these are worthy subjects to talk about. But I think when the bankruptcy comes, when the money fails, and when government fails, and we're in the midst of the failure of government, when it becomes evident, the federal government will become very much less relevant because they can't buy everybody and say, we will give you this, and if you don't do what we tell you, we're going to take it away. They won't have the wherewithal to bribe the people and hold the people in check. The big problem, of course, is they will still have a lot of guns. And the founders were quite accurate when they talked about the reason for the Second Amendment, and it wasn't for rabbit hunting. My goal has always been to make sure we do everything conceivable to prevent that from coming. And that is why I do talk a whole lot about the peaceful means and the intellectual means of confronting bad ideas. To me, the only solution to combat what is happening today is for our views to prevail. Governments usually reflect the prevailing attitudes of the people. So when the attitude of the people is that they accept, because they have been brainwashed with Keynesian economics, and they have accepted the idea that governments just have stuff and they can pass it out, they support the government. But once it becomes known that the government cannot provide any longer and that the money fails, that the people then will have a much greater say in what's happening. Then the government will reflect what the people believe. A good example of how this works is actually how the Fed bill operated and worked out. They never were convinced that the Fed needed auditing. They weren't persuaded by my arguments. I've been arguing for 30 years. But they're listening to people because that message got out when the economic crisis hit. They heard about the TARP funds and the corruption, and all of a sudden a few of us got the information out. Do you know what? If you think the TARP fund corruption is bad, you ought to find out what the Fed has been doing.
Yeah.
People like you at the grassroots who went to the members of Congress and many senators and got their attention. So it does work. We have to believe in that. Otherwise, we will usher in too much, violence that we don't need. But ideas do have consequences. Right ideas are what is necessary. They complain so much now about Washington is not bipartisan enough. All we need to do is be bipartisan and work these problems out. But they never talk about what the bipartisans are going to do.